Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the Dominaria United set review video here on the Daily Draft channel. A new standard legal set has been a long time coming, and I'm sure we're all excited about what Dominaria United has to offer. This video will cover everything you need to know to prepare for your first draft of the new set when it releases on MTG Arena on Thursday, September 1st. I'm choosing to do the set review a little differently here for this set, and rather than doing a card-by-card analysis, I'd like to give you all a guide to each of the viable draft archetypes in the format. But before we hop into the set review content, I'd love for you to support the channel by hitting that subscribe button and sharing the video with a friend. Set review season requires a lot of time and effort to get you the content that I know you're looking for, and a quick subscribe will go a long way in making it all worth it. Before we look at our first archetype in this video, let's start by quickly going over new and returning mechanics for the set. The first mechanic isn't necessarily a mechanic as much as it is a theme for Dominaria United, and it's the fact that legendary matters in this set. In fact, every single draft booster will contain at least one legendary creature in it, so be on the lookout for this powerful subtype in your drafts. A returning mechanic in this set is Kicker. Kicker is an ability that lets you cast the card for its regular casting cost and receive its regular effect, or you can kick the card by paying an additional amount of mana to receive a bonus effect. It is important to note, however, that in Dominaria United, Kicker will only appear as a second color to the card's color identity. For example, with Heroic Charge here, you can pay 2 and 2 white to have all of your creatures get +2/+1 until end of turn, or you can pay 3 generic mana, 2 white mana, and 1 red mana to have all your creatures get +2/+1 and trample until end of turn. Kicker is a great, flexible mechanic that allows cards to have functionality in different situations of the game. Another returning mechanic is Domain. Domain is a keyword that modifies an effect based on the number of basic land types that you control. Sunbathing Rootwalla here has an ability that lets you pay 4 mana to give it +1/+1 for each basic land type among lands you control. It's also important to note that there's a cycle of dual lands at common, like Radiant Grove here, that have both basic land types, and there's one for each of the 10 color pairs. These lands will be incredibly important to domain decks in the format, so that you can increase your basic land type count. Our first new mechanic for this set is Enlist. Enlist allows you to tap a non-attacking creature you control without summoning sickness to add that creature's power to the attacking creature. It's important to note that the creature that is enlisted must not have summoning sickness, and that only its power is added to the attacker, not also its toughness. Our next new mechanic is Read Ahead. This one is pretty straightforward. Read Ahead appears on all sagas in the format, and it allows you to have the saga start on any chapter you choose. Just know that if you choose a chapter later than chapter 1, you will not receive the triggers of any previous chapters. In Braid's Frightful Return here, you have the option to begin on any of the 3 chapters, but if you're willing to read the whole story, you can receive all 3 triggers. And one last note before we dive into each of the archetypes is that Wizards has now come up with an evergreen keyword to represent the Frostlinks effect with stun counters. Stun counters require a counter to be removed instead of that creature becoming untapped. This applies to your untap step in addition to any other effects that would cause this permanent to untap. With all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first archetype for today's video. Our first archetype is Blue-White, which is advertised as a go-wide spells deck. My first thought about that theme is that those 2 points don't exactly work well together, as if you're trying to go wide, you want a bunch of creatures, but if you're trying to cast spells, you obviously need a high spell count. But let's see how this deck comes together, starting with its Signpost Uncommons. Each color pair receives 2 Signpost Uncommons in this set, one that's slightly easier to cast than the other, but both Tura and Wrath here both pay us off for casting instant and sorcery spells by either giving us creatures to help us go wide, or letting us tap those creatures to draw cards. When it comes to going wide, we have resources like Argivian Cavalier, which gives us 2 bodies for 1 card, Resolute Reinforcements has the same effect of 2 bodies for 1 card, Griffin Protector gets buffed whenever another creature ETBs on your side, and Argivian Phalanx is cheaper to cast based on the number of creatures you have. As far as instants and sorceries for the deck, we have access to cards like Stall for Time, which can tap some creatures, possibly put stun counters on them, and even replaces itself. There's also Essence Scatter, which is just a good counterspell in Limited. Take Up the Shield is a good combat trick in Limited to protect all those creatures that you're casting. And Tolarian Geyser is a bounce spell that can gain some life in this archetype specifically. When it comes to the rares and mythics that you should let pull you into this archetype, Haughty Jin is a nice flyer that is both a payoff and enabler for spells, and Ether Channeler is just a generically good rare that can give you card advantage, tempo, or even an extra creature if you need it. Next we have Blue-Black, which is advertised as a control deck. Our signpost uncommons are Vohar and Rona, both of which care about instant and sorcery cards and getting you extra value. Theoretically, these instants and sorceries should be all of the removal that you'll grab in the colors. Our general control cards include traditional removal spells like Extinguish the Light and Cut Down. Rona's Vortex can be a bounce spell or a removal spell if you kick it. Tribute to Urborg is another scalable removal spell with kicker. Braid's Frightful Return gets you all sorts of saga-related value. Essence Scatter is a nice counterspell. Pilfer lets you disrupt your opponent's hand. Phyrexian Espionage is a divination with upside. And Frost Fist Strider gives you some nice tempo while adding to your board. I also wanted to mention that there may be some sort of defender build around in Blue-Black, as both of these colors get an uncommon and a common wall. The uncommons let you have an alternate win con based on how many defenders you assemble. No idea if this is going to be a thing, but I'll certainly be on the lookout. Lastly, here are some of the rares and mythics that you should let pull you into this archetype. The Phasing of Zalfir is a nice board wipe in a color that doesn't usually get it. The Cruelty of Gix is another saga that gives you all kinds of value. Ether Channeler, again, is just a great value card. Shieldred might just be one of the biggest bombs in the entire set. Liliana is a great planeswalker that you can build your deck around. And Urtal lets you do exactly what these sorts of control decks are looking to do. Next we have Red-Black, which is billed as an aggro deck that cares about your creatures dying. Our signpost uncommons, Lagamos and Garna, each give us benefits for our own creatures dying. Those benefits are also relatively aggressively slanted. Some aggressive cards that we have access to for this archetype include Balduvian Berserker, which has the ability to get large and ping something when it dies. Phoenix Chick can't block and can also return from your graveyard. Coalition Warbrute has Trample and can get large and in charge quickly. Hammerhand buffs our creatures and makes our opponents unable to block. Knight of Dusk's Shadow is an aggressively costed menace creature that can get bigger. And Toxic Abomination is a 2-mana 3/2 that comes with a downside that you don't really care about. Some of the cards that care about your creatures dying include Bone Splinters, which is a very efficient removal spell if you have expendable bodies. Sengir Connoisseur gets bigger when other creatures die. Braid's Frightful Return can sack creatures for value. Cult Conscript can come back from the graveyard if certain things die. Phyrexian Vivisector scries when things die. And Warhost's Frenzy lets you draw a card when your creatures die. Lastly, some rares and mythics that might pull you into this deck would be Jaya, because who doesn't love a good planeswalker? Radha's Firebrand as a great aggressive creature that can make blocking difficult. Braids lets you sacrifice your own creatures to force your opponents to do the same or be punished. And Defiler of Instinct gives you tons of abilities and value for its cost. Next we have Red-Green, which is a domain mid-range deck. Our signpost uncommons are Radha and Rulik Mons, one of which very specifically cares about domain, and the other gives you some ramp or creatures depending on what's on top of your deck. Our mid-range tools include cards like Coalition Warbrute, just a decently statted creature for the cost. Linebreaker Baloth, a very similar kind of card with a bit of evasion. Viashino Branch Rider, which can end up with all sorts of different power and toughnesses. Elfheim Worm, which is just a big ol' chonker. Molten Monstrosity, which cares about your other big ol' chonkers. Yavimaya Iconoclast, whose modality offers several great options. And Magnigoth Sentry, just a nice little 4-mana 4/4 with reach. When it comes to our domain payoffs, we have Sunbathing Rootwalla, which can be pumped using domain. Slimefoot's Survey offers us a bit of card selection. Territorial Morrow very specifically cares about exactly domain and nothing else. Sprouting Goblin helps us on our quest for domain. Gaia's Might is a nice little domain combat trick. Maria's Outrider can ping your opponent using Domain, and Nishoba Brawler is a simple but elegant use of the mechanic. Lastly, some rares and mythics that might pull you into this deck include Herd Migration, which is a nice top-end payoff for Domain, Llanowar Green Widow, which is just an objectively good card but shines in this deck, and Radha's Firebrand, which is just about the same as the Green Widow as far as being optimized for this particular deck. Next we have Green-White, which is a go-wide and domain deck. We've already seen these themes in other colors, so there will definitely be some overlap here, which is a good thing for most limited environments. Our signpost uncommons are Queen Alanal and Tsar Ojanin, and they very clearly spell out for us that they care about the number of creatures that we have and the number of basic land types that count toward domain. Some cards that we have access to assist our go-wide strategy are cards like Argivian Cavalier, which gives us 2 bodies for 1 card. Resolute Reinforcements does the same thing at a different spot on the curve. Captain's Call gives us 3 bodies for the price of 1. And Llanowar Stalker gets pumped up each time a creature enters on our side. Some of our domain options include Yavimaya Sojourner, which gets discounted due to domain, Territorial Morrow, which cares about domain for power and toughness, Artillery Blast, which is a removal spell that cares about domain, and Nishoba Brawler, whose power cares about domain. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out in this color pair are Ajani, because again, why not just jam some great planeswalkers in your deck? Guardian of New Benalia, which is just an objectively powerful card for just 2 mana. Leyline Binding, which is a removal spell associated with domain. And King Darien, who can really help us finish out those grindy matchups. Next we have Black-White, and this is the sacrifice deck of the format. Our signpost uncommons, Elas Ilkor and Aaron, specifically allow us to sacrifice other creatures and get value when our own creatures die. This style of deck is usually referred to as aristocrats, and you see a lot of times in red-black, but here we've got it in white-black. Some of our sacrifice outlets and payoffs include Bone Splinters, which is an incredibly cheap way to kill an opposing creature if you have an expendable body. Phyrexian Warhorse can enter with a friend and has a built-in sack outlet on it. Sengir Connoisseur gets bigger whenever other creatures die. Gibbering Barricade allows you to sacrifice your own creatures for life and card draw. Braid's Frightful Return lets you sack a creature for value. Phyrexian Vivisector lets you scry when your creatures die. And Banalish Sleeper can make each player sack a creature if you kick it. All good sacrifice decks need good sacrifice fodder, and in these colors we have access to Splatter Goblin, which can kill an X1 when it dies. Argivian Cavalier, which, again, gives you 2 bodies for 3 mana. And again, same thing with Resolute Reinforcements. Cult Conscripts can keep coming back from the graveyard to be sacrificed again. Phyrexian Rager is a great sacrifice target because it's already gotten you the value when it entered the battlefield. And Captain's Call gives you 3 creatures to sacrifice. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this deck would be Liliana. She's even got sacrifice in her text box. Sarah Paragon lets you return some of those creatures that you've been sacrificing to the battlefield. Defiler of Faith can make 1/1 sacrifice fodder, among other things. And Braids lets you sacrifice those smaller creatures in the hope that they trade for bigger creatures on the other side. Next, we have classic blue-red spells. This is one of the more common archetypes that we see in Modern Limited, but hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Our signpost uncommons for this archetype are Balmor and Najal, which are very clearly state that they want you to be casting instants and sorcery spells early and often. Some of the spells that we have access to in these colors include Flowstone Infusion, which is essentially shock when you want it to be, but can win games out of nowhere too. Fires of Victory can deal some damage based on the number of cards in your hand, and can even be kicked to draw a card. Impulse offers you some nice card selection at instant speed. Lightning Strike is among the best commons in the set, and a great rate for 2 mana. Impede Momentum can buy you some time when that's exactly what you need. Herloon Battle Hymn is 3 mana for 4 damage at instant speed, a card you'll never cut. And Essence Scatter is a nice counterspell in Limited. Some spell payoffs that we have include Volsci Tide Turner, and while it's not quite a payoff, it does help us ramp out our spells. Haunting Figment can represent a real clock if you're casting enough spells. Gitu Amplifier gets a nice buff whenever you cast a spell. Founding the Third Path gives you a second bite at the apple from your graveyard. Academy Wall provides you with some defensive speed and some looting action in this deck. Djinn of the Fountain will act as powerful as a rare in this deck with how many triggers and options you'll be getting. And Electrostatic Infantry is the kind of card that gets out of hand quickly in decks like these. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Temporal Firestorm, which is a nice board wipe in a format that doesn't have many. Keldon Flame Sage, which can give you some nice card draw in a spell-heavy deck. And Haughty Djinn, who cares about your instants and sorceries and makes them cheaper. Next, we have another classic limited archetype in Black-Green Graveyard Matters. This deck hasn't really come together all that well in the last few years, but they do keep on trying, and we'll see if this is the set that it finally breaks out in. Our signpost uncommons are Bortuk and Urg, that both very clearly want us to be keeping track of what we have in our yard so that we can use it for value later in the game. Some of the cards that we have access to in this archetype to take advantage of our graveyard include Braid's Frightful Return, which can get a creature back from our graveyard to our hand, Cult Conscript, which can keep returning back from our graveyard, Writhing Necromass, which gets cheaper based on the number of creature cards in our graveyard, Urborg Repossession, which can rebuy a creature card and gain 2 life for the low cost of 1 mana, and God forbid you're able to kick it for 1 and a green and return another permanent, you'll be rolling in the value. Shadow Prophecy gives us some card draw and dumps some extra cards in our yard if we want to. And Eerie Soultender can mill ourselves for 3 mana and eventually return a different creature to our hand. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for this deck include Urborg Lurgoyf, which counts your creature cards in your graveyard to establish its power and toughness. Llanowar Green Widow, which can return itself back from the graveyard. And the Cruelty of Gix can reanimate a creature from any graveyard on its last chapter. Next we have Red-White Enlist Aggro. We usually get an aggressive red-white deck in almost every format nowadays, and Enlist is the mechanic that will headline this set's most aggressive deck. Our signpost uncommons are Baird and Tori, and both of these generals want you to be going as wide as possible and attacking as often as possible. Some aggressive tools that we have access to here are Keldon Strike Team, which is a 3-mana 3/1, but if you're able to kick it, you get 2 additional 1/1s and they've all got haste. Cleaving Skyrider is another creature with some flexibility if you're able to kick it later in the game. Lightning Strike, again, is one of the best commons in the set, and you'll never cut a copy. And Heroic Charge can be that final push over the finish line that these aggressive decks lack sometimes. When it comes to enlisting the help of our fellow comrades, we're covered by Coalition Warbrute, Banalish Faithbonder, who's a nice little cheap enlist creature with vigilance. Coalition Sky Knight is an evasive threat with enlist that could really finish some games if unanswered. And Samite Herbalist is a secret enlist card because of how much it screams that it wants to be enlisted. If you enlist this creature, you get to gain a life and scry 1 in addition to giving its power boost. We've also got a couple of cards that pull double duty in Balduvian Berserker, which has enlist itself, but can be a lightning strike on occasion when it dies. And Argivian Cavalier, which has enlist, but also comes with a 1/1 body. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for when you're drafting this deck include Rada's Firebrand, which makes blocking difficult for your opponent and threatens a lot of damage in the late game. Guardian of Nubenalia, which has enlist along with the rest of a full text box. Archangel of Wraith, which is a flying lifelinker that can be kicked to throw around extra damage. And Shivan Devastator, which can be a flying hasty threat out of nowhere to finish off those pesky opponents. And our last deck is Blue-Green Domain Ramp. We see Blue-Green Ramp in a lot of sets as well, but the good news is that we know that Wizards knows how to seed this archetype well. Our signpost uncommons are Tatiova and Nael. Tatiova is clearly our ramp-associated general, and Nael is the one that cares about domain. What's great is that these two aspects really do complement each other nicely. Some of the domain tools that we have access to are Pixie Illusionist, which can tap to give you an extra count towards domain if you really need it to. Nishoba Brawler, which counts domain towards its power. Vineshaper Prodigy, which isn't actually associated with Domain, but I couldn't release this video without mentioning how good of a card this is in any deck with green and blue. And Voda Sea Scavenger, which gives you a little bit of card selection associated with Domain. Some ramp tools that we have access to are Joint Exploration, which, when kicked, can ramp you from your hand. Deathbloom Gardener, which might be the only mana dork in the format if I'm not mistaken. And Mossbeard Ancient, which is just a nice ramp target at just the uncommon rarity. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for if this deck interests you are Sphinx of Clear Skies, which is just an insane card unrelated to the fact that it also synergizes in this deck. Silverback Elder, which is difficult to cast, but if you're able to produce enough green mana, will be a near unbeatable bomb. Defiler of Dreams, which, like the Sphinx, is just a stupid card, but obviously great in blue-green shell. And Defiler of Vigor. Not much more to say about these bombs, just cast them and you'll likely win. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this video if you're still here. I know it was a bit of a long one, but I think it'll be very beneficial to have all of this information in one place so that you have an easy way to go find what you need to if you wish to revisit this video throughout the week. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it with a friend or two, as there's a decent chance they might like it as well. And if you're already subscribed to the channel, thanks so much for being here today. But if you're not, go ahead and click that subscribe button to stay on top of preview season and have access to consistent high quality drafts as soon as the set launches on Arena. Looks like that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you next time here at Daily Draft.